In the quiet farming community of Plainfield, Wisconsin, nobody suspected that behind the worn wooden walls of a dilapidated farmhouse lived one of America's most horrifying killers. Ed Gein's story would forever change how the world understood the darkness that could lurk in plain sight. This is the true story of the man who inspired Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and the Silence of the Lambs. November 16, 1957, hardware store owner Bernice Worden had vanished without a trace. Her son, Frank, a deputy sheriff, discovered a disturbing clue: a sales receipt for antifreeze made out to Ed Gein, the last customer his mother had served. When police arrived at Gein's isolated farm that evening, they had no idea they were about to walk into a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. What they found inside that farmhouse defied all comprehension. Hanging upside down from the ceiling, dressed like a deer carcass, was the decapitated body of Bernice Worden. But this was only the beginning of the horror. As investigators moved through the house with their flashlights, they discovered lampshades made from human skin, bowls crafted from human skulls, a belt made entirely of human nipples, chairs upholstered with human flesh. The walls were decorated with masks, but these weren't store-bought Halloween decorations. They were the preserved faces of real women, carefully removed and treated so Gein could wear them like a second skin. He had created a suit made entirely of human skin, complete with breasts and female genitalia. The farmhouse had become a workshop of horrors where Gein had spent years crafting grotesque creations from the bodies of the dead. When questioned about these disturbing discoveries, Gein calmly admitted to robbing 9 graves from local cemeteries, digging up freshly buried bodies in the dead of night. To understand how Ed Gein became a monster, we must go back to his troubled childhood. Born in 1906, Edward Theodore Gein grew up under the iron fist of his fanatically religious mother, Augusta. She was a domineering woman who preached that all women except herself were instruments of the devil. She ran a small grocery store and used the profits to buy an isolated farm outside Plainfield, deliberately keeping her 2 sons away from the corrupting influence of the outside world. His father was an alcoholic whom Augusta despised, and young Ed grew up believing that his mother was the only pure woman on earth. When his brother Henry died under mysterious circumstances in 1944, Ed was left alone with his beloved mother, but this would not last long. In 1945, Augusta suffered a paralyzing stroke. Ed devoted himself completely to her care, but she suffered a second stroke soon after and died on December 29, 1945, at the age of 67. For Ed Gein, this was the end of his world. He had lost his only friend and one true love. He was now absolutely alone. After his mother's death, something inside Ed Gein broke completely. He boarded up the rooms his mother had used, including the upstairs bedroom, downstairs parlor, and living room, leaving them exactly as she had left them, like shrines to her memory. While the rest of the house became increasingly filthy and cluttered, these rooms remained pristine and untouched. Gein lived in a small room next to the kitchen, surrounded by garbage and decay. It was during this time that he became obsessed with reading pulp magazines and adventure stories, particularly those involving cannibals or Nazi atrocities. He was especially fascinated by Ilse Koch, who had been accused of selecting tattooed prisoners at concentration camps for death in order to fashion lampshades and other items from their skins. This macabre interest would soon manifest in the most horrifying way imaginable. Sometime between 1946 and 1956, Ed Gein began his nocturnal activities. He would read obituaries in the local newspaper, focusing on middle-aged women who resembled his mother. Then, armed with a shovel and crowbar, he would visit freshly dug graves under cover of darkness. He later admitted to stealing bodies from 9 graves, targeting women who had been recently buried when the soil was still loose and easy to dig. But grave robbing wasn't enough to satisfy whatever twisted need had awakened inside him. Gein later confessed that soon after his mother's death, he began to create a woman suit so that he could become his mother, to literally crawl into her skin. When questioned about whether he had sexual relations with the corpses, he denied it, explaining simply that they smelled too bad. On December 8, 1954, 51-year-old Mary Hogan, a tavern owner in Pine Grove, Wisconsin, vanished without explanation. Her tavern was found abandoned with a large pool of blood on the floor and a spent cartridge from a .32 caliber rifle. No body was ever found, and the case went cold. That is, until 3 years later when police searched Ed Gein's farmhouse and found Mary Hogan's head in a paper bag. During interrogation, Gein admitted to shooting her, though he later claimed he couldn't remember the details of her death. The discovery of Bernice Worden's body in the House of Horrors in 1957 finally brought Ed Gein's crimes to light. When investigators questioned people who knew Gein, they were shocked by what they learned. A 16-year-old youth whose parents were friends of Gein and who had attended baseball games and movies with him reported that Gein kept shrunken heads in his house. Gein had explained them away as relics sent by a cousin who had served in the Philippines during World War II. Upon investigation by police, these were determined to be human facial skins, carefully peeled from corpses and used by Gein as masks. During questioning, Sheriff Art Schley was so disturbed by Gein's crimes that he reportedly assaulted the killer by banging his head and face into a brick wall. As a result, Gein's initial confession was ruled inadmissible in court. Schley, traumatized by the horror of what he had seen in that farmhouse, died of heart failure in 1968 at the age of 43, before Gein's trial even concluded. Many who knew him said the case had destroyed him. Ed Gein was initially deemed incompetent to stand trial and was sent to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. 10 years later, in 1968, he was finally judged competent. At trial, he was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Bernice Worden, but was judged not guilty by reason of insanity. He was sent back to the psychiatric hospital where he would spend the rest of his life. By all accounts, Ed Gein was a model patient. He was polite, cooperative, and spent his days reading magazines and doing odd jobs around the hospital. He died of respiratory failure on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77, at the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin. He was buried in an unmarked grave next to his mother in Plainfield Cemetery. But Ed Gein's legacy of horror did not end with his death. His crimes had shocked the world and captured the imagination of writers and filmmakers. Author Robert Bloch, who lived just 40 miles from Plainfield, was so disturbed by the case that he wrote the novel Psycho, featuring the character of Norman Bates, a killer with an unhealthy attachment to his mother. Alfred Hitchcock adapted it into one of the most famous horror films of all time. The character of Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, who wore a mask of human skin, was directly inspired by Gein. And the character of Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, who killed women to create a suit of human skin, was based on Gein's gruesome creation. Even today, more than 40 years after his death, Ed Gein remains one of the most infamous killers in American history. Netflix's 2025 series Monster, The Ed Gein Story, starring Charlie Hunnam as the Butcher of Plainfield, has brought renewed attention to his disturbing crimes. The case continues to fascinate and horrify, serving as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the quiet, unassuming neighbors living right next door. The farmhouse where Ed Gein committed his atrocities was destroyed by fire in 1958, just months after his arrest. Many locals believed it was deliberately burned to erase the horror that had taken place there. But the memory of what happened in that isolated Wisconsin farmhouse will never truly disappear. Ed Gein's story remains a testament to the darkest depths of human depravity and the evil that can fester in isolation and madness.